Hello, everyone, and welcome to 3 Words, a bite-sized podcast about the simple and strategic choices that all of us can make in order to become the best version of ourselves. My name is Dr. Michael Brown, and I am the host of 3 Words. And I am so deeply honored to be here today with my friend Martha Chandran-Dickerson. We have become friends over the last couple of years. Our families have become well acquainted, and I am so excited to engage in a conversation that is real and honest and even raw about these incredible times, and particularly about the fact that Black lives matter. So Martha, if you would please, to kind of kick off our conversation today, would you share with our listeners, with our viewers, our 3 words for today?
Fight for justice.
Fight for justice. Martha, as an educator, as a writer, as a thought leader, and a bridge builder, literally the moderator for Be the Bridge here in America, I am just ready to soak up your wisdom and your insights and your perspective on this incredible topic, fight for justice. In fact, it was several podcasts ago where I sat with my dear friend, Dr. Chet Hesson, and the 3 words at that time were consider different perspectives. And I even told him, I said, I look forward to the day when we will follow up that 3 words podcast with 3 more words. That is fight for justice. At that time, I did not know what would happen and what would transpire within our country. I did not know that George Floyd would be brutally murdered. I did not know that we would find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic, and even in the middle of this time of incredible racial inequality, where our corporate consciousness is being awakened to horrible things within our society. But I'm so pleased that I finally get to do those 3 words with you, my friend. Because as a white man who is really seeking to learn what it means to be an ally and an advocate and an activist in this way, I have so much to learn. And so I'm really pleased to be able to sit with you today and hear your perspective on this notion of fighting for justice. But let's actually look a little bit backward. Let's start with this notion, if I may, of justice. What does justice mean to you? And when you think of this notion of justice, what comes to mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Justice, when we think about justice, we usually think about it along partisan lines. But really, justice is this universal issue. And as a person that has grown up all over the world, justice for me personally means how we're all connected as humans. Because justice reminds us that we are all worthy, that we all have value, that we all have dignity.
Absolutely.
Irrespective of our identity, irrespective of our gender, irrespective of our ethnicity or our religious background, each and every one of us have value, and justice is rooted in that idea. And as a person of color, especially, it's like I want to continue to not only look at justice from my perspective, but also how am I also making sure that I am promoting justice for other oppressed groups, So yeah, that's justice is so many different things, but really it comes down to the fact that we're all connected. It brings to mind Martin Luther King's words when he said a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This whole idea of connectedness, that we're all connected in this human experience. And that I feel like as a global citizen, a lot of the issues that we are confront or, that exist in this world reside in this whole notion of us versus them. Because we see others as the other. We don't see them like ourselves. But I think that when we start to see ourselves in the other, in others, then we are motivated, we are compelled to take action.
Yeah. And there's so much common ground.
Right.
If we truly are universally connected, we are so similar.
Mm-hmm.
And yet our differences at times create distance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so sad for me.
Right.
And I think if there's ever a time in the history of our world when we have felt what you just described, Martha, as this universal connection, it's during a global pandemic. I mean,
Right.
you referred to this notion of being a global citizen, which I love, this idea that I am one of 8 billion people. And
Right.
it's like, I'm just one piece of this mosaic, of this incredible puzzle. And yet we're all kind of experiencing the same crisis in regards to COVID-19. Now, granted, we're all experiencing it in a different way at different levels, but there is not a nation, there is not an area of the world that is untouched by this pandemic. And I think we've all felt for the very first time in a very
Right.
tangible way, we are all going through the same thing, which in many ways, as I think about this pandemic and how it relates to this issue of racial inequality in this moment in history within the United States of America, I think in many ways, the pandemic caused us to pause long enough and to shelter for a long enough length of time that when what happened to George Floyd occurred, we were all kind of, it had our fuller attention
Right.
than we would have typically had we been running from thing to thing and
Exactly.
living our lives. So in many ways, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, that the pandemic was not just something happening to us. The pandemic was happening for us. And because of the pandemic, it actually slowed us down enough to be able to wrestle with some of these deeper issues within our culture and society that you described, the us versus them and systematic racism and all of these things that we wouldn't have had the margin to actually wrestle with and dig into. And yet now we have. So I love how you talk about this idea of justice being not just something that is inherent to being American, right? But it's actually rooted in our very creation and who we are as human beings made and created in the image of God.
Yeah. It's rooted in our humanity, that we're all the Imago Dei, the image bearers of God. And it also reminds me, now that you're talking about how the pandemic forced us to pause, and then we had to consider how intertwined we are. The stuff that's happening to other people, the stuff that's happening to Black people is connected to every single one of us. And I love Toni Morrison's words when she said that the function of freedom is not to just be ourselves free, but to free someone else. And I think that this time has really, her prescient words makes so much sense during this time.
And you're modeling that, Martha. You're living that out because you even said early on, and I know you well enough to see you doing this. You're not just thinking about how you can fight for justice for yourself, but even in your own fight for justice for your own self and your own family and some of the things that you've encountered, even as a family of color, you are also looking outward, not just inward, not just self-interested, but also interested sacrificially in how those around you are being affected by all that is taking place. So I am curious, have there been experiences, have there been events in your life for you or your loved ones that you experienced that actually have felt, to be honest, unjust?
Yeah, well, there's been a litany of experiences.
Would you be willing to share a few of those
that I
with
could
us?
recant, but I will definitely share a few examples.
Thank you.
My oldest son, Amani, when he was about 3 or 4 years old, I remember I wasn't actually there. Greg was there, but he was in the playground and there was a group of white children. And as a little 3-4-year-old boy who was by himself, he wanted to play with other children. So he chased after those white children, wanting to play with them, maybe played some tag. But they ran away from him and repeatedly said, "Go away, brown boy. Leave us alone, brown boy." That was one of the first experiences in terms of his experience. But both my boys have been called the pejoratives. They've been called the N-word and the playground, the park, and the school hallways. My husband, Greg, when he was a college student here in Bowling Green and walking downtown, there was a group of white men that drove by in a pickup truck and hurled an egg at him and then, screamed the N-word at him.
My goodness.
So that's a macroaggression, but microaggressions are, he experienced in sociology class, he shared with me that his sociology professor made this statement about how, football players, typically you do not see Black football players playing in the quarterback position because that is the thinking position, kind of, alluding to the, inferiority of Black people in terms of their intelligence. So those are some of his experiences. I mean, there's so many others. And for myself, coming here as an international student and being an immigrant and coming here in 2001, which is the year that 9/11 happened.
Wow.
And so we were in the aftermath of very anti-immigrant, sentiment that was xenophobia was prevalent during that time. And I definitely bore the brunt of that. There was racial profiling and, even at the airport, the TSA would look at my ID like several extra times. And, other people just walked in through without any issues. And, just having to contend with being a brown Asian immigrant in recently post 9/11 America. But even as a young child, just enduring racial violence as young as 3-4 years old in Europe. And so when these things happen, like George Floyd, it's very triggering for me personally.
So these were not even situations only that were here in the United States, but you mentioned Europe. So
yes.
Even experiencing some of that racist behavior, that hostility, even overseas.
Yes.
Wow.
In Belgium. Yeah.
My goodness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so sorry to hear that. And obviously know your boys. And as we've talked about, our boys are kind of growing up together. And I have a 12-year-old son who is biracial, and his biological father is African-American. His biological mother is white, but obviously being a brown-skinned, very active, boisterous young boy, we've talked and begun those conversations about what does it mean to be a Black man in America? And I'm sure you're having the similar conversations with your sons. And obviously Greg is an incredible model of those things. But I'm just curious, your journey is becoming an advocate and actually fighting for justice. We're talking a little bit about justice, and you've described it in such grand and beautiful ways that we are interconnected universally as a global citizen. But now, if we can connect the idea of fighting for justice to justice, when you think about this notion of fighting, because obviously you are an author and a thought leader and an educator, and you're writing and you're really investing in helping us understand and wrap our heads and our hearts around these things. What does it look like for you to be in a noble fight for justice?
Yeah, that's a really good question again. Well, before we fight, we need to first listen. And particularly for those who are in positions of power and who occupy the position of being in the center, we must listen. And while we're listening, we should also learn, whether it's listening to the stories of those around us who are marginalized, their lived experiences, listening to those stories, but also learning the history that's not been taught to us. The history that hasn't been included in the textbooks.
And much of it has been left out, I'm learning.
Much of it is, I'm learning that too. As an immigrant coming here, I was not privy to a lot of American history. But I'm finding that many Americans don't even know true American history.
Yeah.
And I think Greg was sharing that recently someone asked him, how do we dismantle systemic racism? How do we do that? And his answer was to ask another question. Greg's answer was to ask another question, which is, we ask, how did we get here? And I found that profound because, as you know, past is prologue. So until we as Americans are willing to look in the racist reflection and dig deep, and dig deep into those hidden histories, the histories that haven't been told. And there's multiple, not just one, multiple histories, then we're not going to be able to dismantle systemic racism. And so we have to listen, we have to learn, and then we're positioned to take action.
And to fight.
And when we think of fighting, we think it's a violent verb, right? We think of it as a violent verb. But actually fighting in the context of justice is never a violent verb. It's actually, we think of it as violent, as polarizing, but it's peaceful. It can be peaceful, and it can be galvanizing.
Yes.
Because you're coming together, all these different forces, all these different people coming together for this common cause. And fighting isn't just performative allyship. And we've seen a lot of that, where people say they're fighting because they post that black square on Instagram, or they are, hashtagging constantly all day. Yeah. But really it's much more than just those things. It's, purposeful. Mm-hmm. It's persistent. It's in for the long haul. When you are fighting, you have skin in the game, and you're not going to quit until what's needed to be done is done. So I think that we really need to reimagine what fighting looks like. Mm-hmm. And it also is different depending on who's fighting and how, because we all fight differently, right? Like yourself, you use your voice, and I use my pen, and we all can march. We can use our feet and we can march. We can protest and we can jog for Ahmaud Arbery. Mm-hmm. There's various ways in which we can come into this fight. And it's not just one way. Yeah,
I love that. And for even me as a white man who has experienced tremendous white privilege, I've been thinking deeply ever since these conversations began post George Floyd. And I thought some of it before George Floyd. I've not been completely distant from these conversations, and yet they feel more real to me now. And particularly as I've been developing a list of individuals that are friends of mine who are brown and black, and actually engaging on a regular basis with individuals and saying, tell me your story. I want to be an advocate, Martha. I want to be someone who is in this with you and is in this for my son and for your sons and for Greg, your husband. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And we joked off camera, but I love alliteration. But one of those, the 5 F's of advocacy, as I have conceptualized in my own mind, and maybe you can use this to even spring into some of the other thoughts that you would have, the first one is fighting. Mm-hmm. I want to be involved in the fight, but I also want to develop friendships, because real relationships matter. Face to face, human interactions, developing not just friendliness, but friends with people of color, black and brown, and immigrants, and those who've been raised, and all kinds of people. It's just a beautiful diversity, but also focus. Mm-hmm. I want to stay focused, and I want to actually lean into what you said and learn and listen financially. I want to begin to invest financially in causes that matter. And so obviously fighting for me is about focus and friendship and finances, but also finally fortitude. I don't want to give up. I don't want this just to be a flare that went up and then it fizzles out. I want to stay the course with you, alongside of you, with my brown and black brothers and sisters. But it begins and involves this notion of being involved with the fight. So obviously, as you're speaking, my guess is predominantly, even today, to predominantly a white culture. Mm-hmm. What is your advice to us? What would you want us to know who are seeking to be encouraged in how to best partner with you in the fight of social justice causes?
Yes. And like I alluded to before, it can't just be this momentary kind of like, it's trendy now to be, Black Power, BLM, all of that. Yeah. You have to be willing, like you said, the fortitude. And to that point, you can actually choose to have fortitude. But for many of us, particularly Black people, you don't have a choice. You have to be strong. You don't have a choice to opt out and to be weak, because otherwise what happens? You cease to exist.
And I can choose to opt out because it's not in front of me every single day.
Yeah.
I have to put myself there.
Exactly.
And for some of my white brothers and sisters, they've said it's exhausting. And I'm thinking, well, how much more so for our black and brown friends who they are so tired. They are so deeply fatigued by fighting this battle day in and day out.
It is exhausting.
Oftentimes with people alongside people who are just rolling their eyes saying, it's not as bad as you say, or it's not as difficult as people paint. And the more I enter into people's stories and the more I hear even today for the first time, some of your stories, it is really intense.
It is exhausting. And I think for you to acknowledge that is really powerful and profound, because then with that in mind, then when you do get weary and fatigued, then you realize that for the rest of us, we don't have that luxury of opting out. But you also extending yourself in the effort to educate yourself, because a lot of times, like I would get phone calls or like, oh, can you send me this resource, or what do you think, or blah, blah, blah. And, I am of the disposition that I'm willing to do that. But for many people, especially black people and like black people like my husband, they're like, please go and find the resources yourself, educate yourself, because it's enough as it is to have to be reminded of your blackness and of the fact that you're still in this struggle in 2020. But then now you have to help white people and other people that are not black.
Who are temporarily compassionate.
Exactly.
And are momentarily engaged to be
it's exhausting it's exhausting going through trauma and PTSD and all of that. And then now you have to be the educator. So you're asking, what advice could you give is really do the work yourself.
Do the work yourself.
Do the work and keep your eyes open, your ears open, your heart open.
And I don't think you talk about as white individuals, we can choose to opt out. I would say that it's hard to opt out though, when my life is entangled with yours, when my family is entangled with your family, when my relationships and my friendships with black and brown individuals are as significant and as deep and as meaningful as they are with my white majority friends. And so I think one of the best things I can continue to do is stay relationally connected to pursue a depth of friendship that parallels a lot of my other white friendships. Yeah. Because then, of course, I won't opt out. Because it's not a concept to me. It's a community.
Right.
It's not this principle. It's about people.
Right.
It's about real relationships. So, wow, we could talk forever, but I would just love to give you the final word, Martha, as you think about this conversation of fighting for justice. And I look forward to having you on the podcast again to have some more of these conversations. But a final word for us, or a final thought that you would just like to kind of leave as we really, I think even those who are listening to 3 words are wanting to learn. They're wanting to grow. They're wanting to be the best version of themselves, but also not just for themselves, but for the world around them. What would you say to us?
I would say that the time for justice is now. Not later, not tomorrow. It's now. Justice cannot wait. Wow. What a great place to end. Justice is now. We don't want to punt this down the field. We don't want to say, well, that's something we'll do after the pandemic, or that's something we'll do in, 2022 when things calm down a bit. No. Justice is now. So I want you to hear me, Martha, and please share on behalf of Teresa and I and our children and our family to you and Greg and your boys that we are connected to you and we are bound to you and we are excited to be on this journey alongside of you to fight for justice. For life coaching, consulting services, or to hire a keynote speaker, please visit dmbcoaching.com.